Welcome to this afternoon's Humanities Forum, the Bob Webb Annual Lecture. This is a special lecture because it's named, of course, after our special speaker today, Professor Emeritus Robert K. Webb. I'd like to remind you that we have two more Humanities Forum events this fall. On November the 10th, the annual W.E.B. Du Bois Lecture with Mary Frances Berry, speaking on politics and policy in the 21st century. Does race still matter? And on November 30th, James Counts Early from the Smithsonian Institution will be speaking on social movements and participatory cultural democracy in Latin America and the United States in a time of crisis. Connected to the topic of today's lecture on 18th century Britain, UMBC's theater department will be putting on a staged reading of the comedy, The Basset Table, on December 9th and 10th. The Basset Table was written in 1705 by Susanna, I'm going to pronounce it in French, Saint-Rivre, one of the most successful English playwrights of her day. In its depiction of a young woman with a passionate interest in natural philosophy, The Basset Table deftly examines issues of the day, including the rise of science and the education of women. Produced in collaboration with UMBC's Department of Music, The Basset Table is being created as a radio play and podcast. On December 9th and 10th, the actors will perform live and unplugged on stage to launch the podcast. Please pick up a flyer. Let's see, I think that's one of my cheat sheets, like this, that are on the benches out there, as well as one of the Humanities Forum brochures. Now, it's my honor, by the way, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Rebecca Bowling, and I'm the director of the Drescher Center. It's now my honor to introduce Richard Byrne, who will be introducing Bob Webb for us today. Richard Byrne returned to UMBC in 2008 as the founding editor of the UMBC magazine, my other show and tell. And you will see copies of those around as well. I say returned because he was an undergrad English major here from 1984 to 1986. In the interim, he was one of the editors at the Chronicle for Higher Education. His writing has been published in places ranging from The Guardian, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, The American Prospect, and on Time Magazine's website. In 1999, Richard Byrne was awarded a Pew Fellowship in International Reporting to study media in post-war Bosnia. Richard Byrne is also an award-winning playwright. His second play, Burn Your Books, was performed this past spring in Washington, D.C. at the Taffety Punk Theater Company. A former student of Dr. Webb, Richard will be introducing Dr. Webb this afternoon.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker. Professor Emeritus of History Robert K. Webb is one of the preeminent scholars of religion and social movements in Great Britain. To borrow a term from basketball, Professor Webb has a terrific inside and outside game. First, the inside game. Professor Webb's work on class and literacy, including 1955's The British Working Class Reader, 1790 to 1848, Literacy and Social Tension, and his 1960 biography of one of the key women thinkers of the Victorian era, Harriet Martineau, a radical Victorian, remain classics in the field and spurs to what became a sweeping re-examination and re-evaluation of the ferment of the Regency and Victorian England. Close, hard-nosed scholarship is the key to an inside game. And from these particulars, Professor Webb proceeded to works of much greater scope and expanse, including 1968's Modern England from the 18th Century to the Present, and his collaboration with Peter Gay on 1973's Modern Europe to 1815. Both books required the nimbleness to wrestle with detail and also survey the larger currents and vistas. Distance and accuracy, the very definition of an outside game. Professor Webb's career did not confine itself to scholarship, but also included a healthy dollop of service to his profession and to American intellectual life, including stints as editor of American Historical Review and the AAUP Bulletin. But if you'll permit me a brief personal aside, I want to thank Professor Webb for another key part of his career in the Academy, his teaching. I was fortunate enough to take an honor seminar on science and religion with Professor Webb during my time at the university in the 1980s. What remains with me from that time is not only Professor Webb's erudition, expressed with a cheerfulness that contained within it great scholarly rigor, but also his generosity. Many teachers are content to impart their knowing to you. Some go a step beyond and give you tools to help find out knowing for yourself. But in my experience, Professor Webb went even a step further. He discovered places in my mind where original thought about intellectual issues and history might develop, exposed them to the light of his knowing, and warmly encouraged me to continue thinking about these issues after the seminar's end. If I succeeded all in investigating and untangling knotty intellectual issues in my own work as a playwright and a journalist, Professor Webb's generosity helped me to develop those skills. So today, Professor Webb will talk about the clashes and collaborations between religion and science in the era which has held his scholarly interest for so many decades. A talk entitled The Very Long 18th Century, An Experiment in the History of Religion? ? I'm delighted to give you Professor Robert K. Webb.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. You hear me?
Yep.
Thank you very much for that most generous and, I suspect, undeserved introduction. If I remember correctly, the first Webb lecture was given in 1955. So it seemed to me, I'm sorry, 1995. So it seemed to me that it was high time that I reminded this audience that it is not yet the Webb Memorial Lecture. That time may come. At any rate, my title is a play on the long 18th century, a phrase that originated in 1986 with the valuable and much discussed book by the controversial historian J.C.D. Clark, then at Cambridge, now at Kansas. Clark had set out to rebut what he saw as the legion of liberal, radical, and especially secular historians of England by arguing that an English, as he called it, confessional state held sway from the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 to the first Reform Act of 1832, hence the long 18th century. I'm entering on the same ground the role of religion in English society and the nexus of religious and political structures, even the self-image of the nation. And I do mean England, which in religion was distinct from the other nations that make up what we now refer to as Britain. My interpretation rests on my reading, and in particular on my own research into the history of English Unitarians. The English what, you may ask? Well, Unitarianism in the United States, emerging from Congregationalism and centered historically in St. John, Boston, is reasonably familiar, I'm sure, to all of you, or many of you. The far less well-known Unitarian movement in England grew primarily out of and ultimately absorbed English Presbyterianism, shifting from a theological position to a denomination in the years around 1800. But while American Unitarianism has retained its prominence, Unitarianism in England, even more widespread and influential there in the 19th century, has been almost forgotten. Its congregations have dwindled in numbers and prominence. Many of its once grand churches in the centers of provincial towns were destroyed in the Second World War, have been deserted by their congregations for the suburbs, or have been abandoned to other faiths. Now, I'm not going to recount that history today, but will rather use some insights and illustrations drawn from it to answer a much broader set of questions about religious developments in English society over the past 300 years. The terminal dates of my very long 18th century are broader and less precise than Clark's. from somewhere in the 1640s to the 1880s. What, for me, gives a unity to the longer period is the growing and ultimately triumphant role played in English thought and institutions by reason. Now, the old characterization of the 18th century as the age of reason, a phrase beloved by historians and publishers 50 or so years ago, has rightly succumbed to almost a century of historical study of English religion. Indeed, one could argue that the 18th century was, to the contrary, a great, broadly sweeping religious age. Witness the mystical piety descending from William Law early in the century, deeply important ingredient of High Church Anglicanism, or the vast, slightly later impact of John Wesley and the Methodist movement, or the extension of Wesley's emphasis on deep personal and devotional religion to the wider evangelical movement in Low Church Anglicanism, and an overwhelming proportion of the dissenting denominations, Congregationalists, Baptists, Quakers, or the increasingly wide influence of the cult of sensibility and incipient Romanticism later in the century. The fact remains, however, that the thought and legacy of the 18th century were dominated by the figure of Sir Isaac Newton. Newton was and remains enigmatic and contradictory, addicted to alchemy and numerology even as he revolutionized astronomy and physics and laid the foundation of modern mathematics. But whatever Newton's ambiguities, he dominated field after field of inquiry, not least in the determination of the proto-romantic poet and artist William Blake to overthrow that preeminence. But why not start earlier, in the earliest decades of the 17th century, with the figure of Sir Francis Bacon, often thought of as the prophet of modern science? A simple reason. Bacon was a dualist who viewed science and religion as mutually exclusive, each obedient to its own imperatives. By his standards, 18th century efforts to subject religion as well as nature to rational understanding were misbegotten. The heralds of this approach, rather, were the organizers of the Royal Society in the 1660s, the first and still preeminent organization for cultivating scientific progress, and, more obscurely, the like-minded friends who in the early 1640s gathered at Great Kew, T-E-W, the Oxford estate of the second Viscount Falkland, where their debates emphasized the intermingling of religion and rational inquiry, as did a group of Cambridge scholars at mid-century known collectively as the Cambridge Platonists. Now, I won't presume to trace the successive triumphs of science from the late 17th century, except to note that they progressed from Newton's achievement in mathematics, astronomy, and mechanics through successive and continuing revolutions in emerging disciplines: chemistry, medicine, surgery, psychology in the 18th century, geology in the early 19th century, electricity and biology in mid-century. The last, of course, centering on the figure of Charles Darwin. A neat quotation. The English Reformation was an act of state. That is the admirably succinct opening sentence of a brief study of the Reformation by a distinguished English medievalist nearly 80 years ago. The Reformation was accomplished in a series of statutes in the 1530s that broke the connection with the papacy, created the royal supremacy, and dissolved the monasteries. But as Canterbury supplanted Rome, Catholic doctrine remained little touched, as it was enshrined in the formal statement of Anglican beliefs, the 39 Articles, and in the literary and emotional triumphs of the Book of Common Prayer and the English liturgy, dating from the 1540s. But after the return of Catholicism under Queen Mary in the 50s, a number of English religious leaders, to avoid likely death at the stake, took refuge in Geneva, then dominated by the thought and rule of John Calvin. When the Protestant Church of England was recreated under Queen Elizabeth, they returned to positions of leadership, and their Calvinist-inspired theology remained the norm in England for a century. In Scotland, another Genevan emigre, John Knox, imposed on the Northern Kingdom not only Genevan theology, but also the Genevan system of church governance, which never took hold in England. In 1940, when I entered Oberlin College as a freshman, I signed up for a Save course in modern European history under a professor who, by example and encouragement, made me into a historian and an English historian. One day, someone asked a question about Calvin, and at the beginning of the next class, Professor Robinson said that he had, as promised, checked in Calvin's institutes. Now, he said, I'm nominally a Presbyterian myself, but it's a great deal worse than I thought. I don't mean to depreciate the religious and more broadly historical importance of Calvinism, but even before the beginning of the very long 18th century, a growing number of Englishmen had come to think that Calvinism was a great deal worse than they or their predecessors had thought. In particular, the central Calvinist doctrine that God had predestined only a few to salvation, while the vast majority of men and women were consigned to everlasting damnation. After the Civil War in the 1640s and the Cromwellian interregnum in the 50s, the monarchy and the Church of England were restored in 1660. But unforgiving royalists and Anglicans imposed a narrow structure in organization and belief on the Church and on the two ancient universities of Oxford and Cambridge, thus precipitating in 1662 the great and complex movement outside the Church known as dissent or nonconformity. For the rest of the reign of Charles II, 1685, and especially in the reign of James II, from 1685 to 1688, the new dissenting sects were subject to severe legal restraints and sporadic persecution. Freed from the severest of those restraints after the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, they remained subject to discrimination and occasional violence, even after the establishment of the Hanoverian dynasty in 1714. The Church of England was not monolithic in either belief or practice. At one end of the spectrum stood what we now know as Anglo-Catholicism, or the High Church movement. Emerging at the other end were the latitudinarians, latitude men, in the contemporary phrase applied to the Cambridge Platonists and others. There had even been a short-lived Unitarian movement in the Church of England in the 1670s and 80s. Secured against persecution because it remained illegal under the Toleration Act until 1813 by the enormous reputation of its chief advocate, a wealthy philanthropist named Thomas Firmin, F-I-R-M-I-N. Dissent lagged by a generation or so, but in the first half of the 18th century, it recapitulated the loosening within Anglicanism, moving through Arianism, so-called, in the early 18th century, to the rational dissent of mid-century. And it was within rational dissent that the debate, going back to the earliest centuries of Christian history, about the doctrine of the Trinity, the union of the three persons of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in one indivisible Godhead, took its modern form. Jesus, in this view, was not a God, but a divinely inspired man. Let me first talk about what I'm not going to talk about. the views of ordinary worshippers, for the simple reason that we know and can find out very little about them. We know more about the thinking and feeling of those at the top, or top middle, of the social pyramids in a congregation and a community than we do about the humbler occupants of the pews. 19th and 20th century inquiries mostly fail us. The religious census, added in 1851 to the regular decennial census, so appalled religious and secular leaders by its revelation of empty pews that there has never been another religious census. Private investigations have been more limited, and even sociologists today, rightly curious about the growth of secularism, have found no broader index that I'm aware of than the crude measure of church attendance, which tells us nothing about belief. And there are real limits to what individual historians can do, faced as they are with inadequate time and forever inadequate sources. There was, however, one way in which ordinary congregations could make their feelings known. A clerical post in the Church of England was at the disposal of patrons, individual or corporate, a landowner, say, whose family had established and endowed the parish, a college, or even the state. And there were some wonderful instances of standoffs between parson and squire or corporation that lasted for years. But the dissenting congregations offered no such protection. On occasion, when a clergyman who had left the Church of England for a dissenting congregation found himself facing dismissal, the differing perceptions of clerical tenure could prove awkward. The committee wanted him out, he thought he had the right to stay. In an age when listening to sermons was one of the few forms of public entertainment, Sunday evening services among the dissenters offered a chance to sample the competition or to try out a new man in town. Most ministers, whatever their denomination, chose not to preach doctrine from the pulpit, preferring moral sermons, which people liked to hear and which they could apply to personal or public affairs. But there were other considerations. Was the minister sufficiently earnest? Did he preach from the heart? Did he read his sermons or improvise them? One minister confessed that extempore preaching took far longer to prepare for than did writing a sermon. What was the minister's personal appeal? Was he even comprehensible or even audible? In a lot of cases of what an American historian has called preacher's sore throat. From inadequate training, there was a loss of voice, and maybe they had to retire for a few years to regain their capacity to preach. But congregational committees were quick to notice decline in attendance or less full collection plates. One committee said that their minister had unfortunately preached away 20 guineas. But tastes and fashions change. And one young Liverpool minister in the early 30s, whose committee had great concerns about what they called his style and manner, retired from that congregation 50 years later, full of years and honor. The somewhat convoluted style that had posed a problem to the committee in the 30s fitted well in an age of high Romanticism. And it was said, I love this, that merely seeing him enter the pulpit was more valuable than a whole sermon from anyone else. Nor was his survival hindered by his having married the daughter of one of the most prominent and wealthy members of the congregation. Occasionally, heartfelt views do emerge from the pews, but to little or no purpose. There was the elderly lady in the middle of the 18th century, in improbably the congregation of one of the most eminent rational dissenters, who insisted, also improbably, that the religious rot of her time had set in when people gave up their belief in ghosts. And a century later, to stray for a moment across the Atlantic, a missionary who was trying to convert residents in the northern neck of Virginia to Unitarianism was told by locals that the effort was hopeless because there was too much liver complaint in the district. A suggestion of cause and effect that William James would have understood. To use his terms, what chance can a healthy-minded religion have with a sick soul who had a chronically nauseated body? Perhaps, though, the most pertinent, if unhelpful, revelation I've come across of what an ordinary believer thought came in the mid-18th century from the diary of an obscure and rather dim member of a dissenting congregation in Leeds, who reacted to the growing multiplicity of doctrines to which he'd been exposed by saying only, resignedly, "Where it will all end, God knows." From this hugely complex yet threadbare tapestry, I want to offer two differing illustrations from the calendar 18th century of accommodation of religion to reason, and its crucially important analogues of criticism and scholarly inquiry. To begin with, for an infallible text, the Bible poses problems. There are many conflicting details in the four gospel accounts of the life of Christ, and much ink was spilled in the 16th and 17th century to establish what was called the harmony of the Gospels, a concern that broadened in the 18th century. The traditional reliance on documentary evidence from inside and outside Christian boundaries reached a kind of climax in the 15 volumes of The Credibility of Gospel History, published 1727 to 57, by Nathaniel Lardner, a dissenting scholar equally admired by Anglicans for his prodigious research. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the quest for reconciliation was pursued not only by scholars and theologians, but by amateurs. The radical Cambridge Don, John Jebb, encouraged his undergraduate pupils to resolve such conflicts in the gospel narratives for themselves. And in Norwich, Harriet Martineau, while still in her teenage years, also the teenage years of the new century, immersed herself in the texts and the geography of the Holy Land to reconcile the gospel accounts, and deepen her already intense belief. The Theological Repository was a periodical founded by the famous Unitarian theologian, dissenting minister, and pioneering chemist Joseph Priestley. And it was published irregularly between 1769 and 1788, and provided a vehicle in which Priestley and his friends could propose naturalistic or linguistic solutions to conflicts in the Bible. My favorite is the exchange over the accounts in Matthew 21, verses 18 to 21, and Mark 11, verses 12 to 14, of the blighting of the fig tree. The texts tell us that being hungry on returning from Bethany, Jesus spied a fig tree in leaf, but when he drew closer, he saw that it bore no figs. Thereupon, he blasted the fig tree forever. Jesus told the amazed disciples that this seemingly, at least to me, petulant act demonstrated the power of faith, which a verse later, he insisted more famously, could also move mountains. Still, as Priestley himself said, there remains the question of how the physical deed was actually accomplished. How is the fig tree blighted? At the very least, as one of Priestley's friends and colleagues pointed out, that explanation of the text would require far more information than people in England had about the fig season and the pattern of growth of fig trees in the eastern Mediterranean. At the end of the century, the question of evidences was absorbed into a wider naturalistic and theological framework. The ancient astronomer Ptolemy and his successors had tried to explain variations in observations in the solar system and stars from ideal geometry by devising epicycles, an enterprise that by the time of Copernicus in the 16th century had become laughably complicated. Hence arose what became known as the argument from design. As the argument's most famous illustrator, William Paley, explained in his Natural Theology in 1802, one might scarcely notice the stone over which one stumbles while walking on the moor. But if one had stumbled over a watch and picked it up and examined the intricate relationships of its parts, would have no doubt that the watch was the result of a creating intelligence. But that was true of the stone or any other object in nature. Sufficient inquiry would point to the power of a creating God. The eye and the hand, in their exquisite complexity, were thought to provide powerful evidence against accident as a creative force. And there were many physicians as well as ministers to argue the case. This explanatory system reached something of an apogee in the bequest in 1825 of the fabulously wealthy, at last, Earl of Bridgewater, to endow the publication of 8 treatises illustrating the divine authorship of nature. After complex negotiations, the lecture was commissioned from 8 distinguished and authoritative scientists and published in 1833-37. Although these volumes enshrined the theory, they were not its tombstone. In 1860, Harriet Martineau, confident in her newfound atheism, expressed to her friend Fanny Wedgwood her worry that Darwin's few scattered references in The Origin of Species to a creator would offer an escape from his important conclusions to those who insisted on the divine authorship of the world and its processes. She was right. Natural theology continued to provide an explanatory system for believers well beyond Darwin's challenge, a role it has played right down to the present. But I would like, as was said to television viewers 30 years ago, to something entirely different. And the creative system advanced by David Hartley, 1705 to 57, the son of a relatively poor Anglican minister in Yorkshire. Hartley graduated from Cambridge in 1727, but finding unacceptable the oaths that he would have had to swear to become, as he'd expected to be, an Anglican priest, he became instead a physician, practicing in Newark, London, and later in Bath. His first intimations of his masterwork were published in 1735, with further glimpses in the early 1740s. In 1749, after a decade and a half of prodigious research, came the 2 volumes of Observations on Man, His Frame, His Duties, and His Expectations. 3 key sources lie behind Hartley's synthesis: John Locke's theory of association of ideas, a suggestion appended to Newton's optics about vibrations, and the widespread speculation in early 18th century moral philosophy that man was designed and destined for happiness. Our observations of the external world, Hartley theorized, are transmitted to the brain by vibrations in the nerves. There, by repeated association, they became fixed as ideas that can be summoned up either voluntarily or involuntarily. These could include moral as well as physical and intellectual ideas, and by repetition and experience could be transmuted into habits. Hartley's theory of vibrations was subjected even by warm admirers to criticism. It was, remember, still a pre-electrical age, and the gap between Franklin's kite-borne key and the synapses that neurophysiologists talk about today is vast. I might add that there are dramatic congruences in Hartley's observations and those that arise in present-day brain research using magnetic resonance imaging. This physical explanation of the mind's working had profound effects on the next generation. Among others, on Unitarian theologians and laymen, and more widely, on Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, and his son John Stuart Mill, and the utilitarian movement that descended from them. Hartley can thus be seen as the founder of modern English psychology, a word he is credited in the Oxford English Dictionary with being the first to use. The first volume of the Observations, which contains these highly original speculations, is a seminal contribution to English thought. Among his most fruitful speculations are perceptive passages on the centrality of education and on the origins and learning of language. Very important, it appears historically, to the movement for the training of deaf mutes to speak. The second volume of the Observations, which contains Hartley's ethical and religious speculations, has been less valued and indeed even seen as entirely separable from the psychology of the first. But a brilliant study by Richard C. Allen, published in 1999, has demonstrated a unity to Hartley's thought that has escaped nearly all previous commentators. As Allen explains, the mechanisms of the first volume provide the means by which the perfection of man, the redemption of all mankind, and eternal bliss are to be attained. This is an ultimate rejection of the Calvinist scheme, and it's rooted solidly in the science of Hartley's time. Allen's research is simply remarkable on the sources in medicine and everything. Now, if the great editor in the sky were to command a subtitle for this section of my talk, I would surely choose The Age of Accommodation. But what could I find to sum up the first two-thirds of the 19th century? An age of fear, panic, or loss, of hostility, even of nastiness. From the turn of the century, party lines within and between Anglicanism and dissent became much more clearly drawn. In part, this derives from the hugely unsettling effects of the French Revolution and the emergence of reform movements in Britain. In part, it derives from the equally unsettling revelations of the growing and newly professional sciences. Geologists and paleontologists demolished the famous calculation by Archbishop Usher in the 17th century that the 6 days of creation had occurred in 4004 BC. The world had now become unimaginably ancient and unimaginably changeable. Biblical evidence, notably the flood, were fatally wounded, miracles were deeply threatened, and man's central place in the scheme of things was deeply shaken. But I would like to put particular emphasis in that regard on the impact of the argument advanced by David Friedrich Strauss in Germany that miracles and many other aspects of the biblical narrative were only to be expected given the myths that inevitably grow up around leaders of great religious movements. They were not factual at all. The first English awareness of Strauss was probably provoked by a widely publicized lecture given in the early 40s by Philip Harwood, a West Country Baptist educated at the University of Edinburgh, who had been briefly in the 30s a Unitarian minister and later became a distinguished and highly influential journalist. Harwood's work was given wider impact, Strauss's work was given wider impact by the translation of the great work by a young woman known better to us as the novelist George Eliot. Strauss was the source of much of the panic. At about the same time, a respected Unitarian minister and teacher, John Kenrick, argued in a brief essay that the Old Testament was as good as useless as a historical source, a function it had long maintained. In the meantime, severe interdenominational fractures had taken place, most notably in the Church of England, in the extensive conversion of ministers to Roman Catholicism, touched off by the defection of John Henry Newman to Rome in the 1840s, but also by theological splits that were ultimately decided in the civil courts. The Gorham case in 1851 on the obscure question of baptismal regeneration, and the controversy in the early 60s over a volume of modernist theology called Essays and Reviews. With all these debates roiling the church, the uproar over Darwin's 1859 volume on natural selection was only one among many deeply divisive challenges. Then, suddenly in the 1880s, all this theological and ecclesiastical turmoil came to an end, or at any rate was diverted. A key figure in the transformation was the Reverend, later Bishop Charles Gore, a high churchman influential at Oxford and in time throughout Anglicanism, a theological modernist and founder of the Christian Social Union. All activities indicative of a new orientation in the church. In Roman Catholicism, the long papacy of Leo XIII, from 1878 to 1903, constituted a huge displacement from the staunch anti-liberalism that marked the preceding, even longer reign of Pius IX. Particularly notable for the Syllabus of Errors, issued in 1864, to catalog the most lamentably misguided positions of liberalism. Leo XIII's encyclical De Rerum Novarum of 1891 moved the Church away from its old doctrinaire position toward an explicit critique of capitalism. Thank you. Back in the 1980s, I was asked to contribute an essay on Quakers and Unitarians to a bibliographical volume. I had my doubts. I've frequently been asked when someone learns of my interest in Unitarians, they're like Quakers, aren't they? To which the short answer is no. But I eventually decided that someday I would have to learn more about Quakers than I had from reading two excellent histories of the denomination. And I decided that the most efficient way to do that was not to do it at the Library of Congress where I would have to call up repeated things from the stacks and plan to get there a couple of days later. But to go to the Quaker Library at Swarthmore College, where all the needed books and periodicals would be on the open shelves. I presented myself at the desk, presided over by a somewhat fierce-looking elderly lady. As I recall, her gray hair was drawn up in a bun at the back. Not sure that it had a pencil with a date stamp stuck into the bun, but it could have. I told her I was interested in learning more about 19th century Quakerism. Disaster, she said. She roared in a distinctly non-librarian tone. Disaster. Recovering from the shock, I went about my inquiries and was soon reminded that Quakerism, though always committed to certain forms of social activism like anti-slavery, had been solidly evangelical from the 18th century. But it was also kept in turmoil on both sides of the Atlantic by rebellions against conventional Quaker views that led to schism, mostly to the benefit of Unitarians. This and the failure to grow, presumably, were the disasters she referred to. But again, almost overnight in the 1880s, the denomination as a whole abandoned evangelicalism to become the liberal and even more broadly activist Quakerism we know today. Unitarianism offers not only the example I know best, but also possibly the most sweeping reorientation. For a generation, the denomination had been caught up in disputes triggered by James Martineau, Harriet's younger brother, and the most respected and influential figure of the century in the denomination. The positivism and scientism of the early Unitarian generations, loyal to Hartley and Priestley, were giving way to a new, romantically tinged Unitarianism, emphasizing the supremacy of internal religious impulses, free will against determinism, and a warmer, more personal outlook. This generation-long quarrel between the so-called old and new schools was not pretty. And many once respected ministers were deeply wounded by what was said and done by younger aggressors. But in the mid-60s, as matters came to a head, a majority of Unitarian ministers, although many of them were undoubtedly sympathetic to the old school, opted for the freedom of interpretation that had been established in a similar dispute among Presbyterians in the early 18th century. We may not agree with you, but if it is what you find, then so be it. Looking forward to the 20th century, a whole range of new interests came to preoccupy the religious world, making the theological disputes of the preceding decades seem suddenly quaint. One category had simply to do with survival. As easier travel, thanks to railways, ended isolation, the spread of newspapers and other print media expanded awareness, and possibly most corroding, the expansion of new kinds of social activity moved the country's focus outside the relatively closed circles of home and parish or chapel. Congregations across the religious spectrum had for 40 years resorted regularly to mounting bazaars, participatory activities, sales, refreshments, and so on, that could seem excessively preoccupied by the early 20th century. Ministers in the late Victorian period established a panoply of discussion groups with young men in their congregations, in which the topics were heavily biased toward social questions and liberal politics. A final illustration from Unitarianism. Over many visits in the 1980s and 1990s, I spent untold hours in the library of the Meadville Lombard Theological Seminary in Chicago, where on the lowest and darkest and coldest level of the stacks were kept the most complete run in this country of the Unitarian weekly newspaper, The Inquirer, which, incidentally, changed its subtitle around 1912 from a journal of religion and society to a journal of society and religion. Now, there are few tasks more deadening than turning over the pages of newspapers, hoping for something interesting to turn up. And one day was so long and so dreary that I began to wonder why I had got into this business instead of into something regularly more rewarding and stimulating. But then I came across something that made it all worthwhile. This is why historians become historians. It was an article by the Reverend Philip Henry Wicksteed, the son of a major leader of the New School, and himself not only a great minister and an important literary figure, but a prominent theorist in the rebellion against Orthodox and New Orthodox economics. The churches, Wicksteed argued, cry for guidance, but the churches can no longer supply that guidance. Where then should the churches turn but to sociology? In the last third of the century, the denominations competed in the founding of new churches and chapels in seaside resorts, while dissenters made prudential efforts to shield and retain students attending the old and new universities. In some ways, the most dramatic and revealing instances lay in the transplantation of old colleges for the training of dissenting ministers to, of all places, Cambridge and even more, Oxford, the very heartland of the traditional dissenting enemy. Cambridge, to be sure, had long emphasized mathematics and lateral of the sciences, but Oxford, the center of traditional Anglican views, was itself undergoing a remarkable transformation, not only as a competitor to Cambridge in the sciences, but in theology. Two trends seem to me particularly striking. One is the huge shift of interest across the religious spectrum from theology and devotional matters to a passionate involvement in social reform, and so in politics and administration. Gore's 1890 manifesto, Lux Mundi, illustrates how much more deeply churchmen had become involved with social questions and their solution. As dissenting representation in Parliament exploded, so too did its impact on local government. Not only dissenting laymen, but ministers were much more in evidence in town councils and on school boards and in charitable enterprises. There was also an expansion of interest in other religions. This awareness had begun in the 18th century, but a century later had become a dominant concern. In the great 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, published in 1911, the article on religion is in two parts. The first, by an Oxford anthropologist, deals with primitive religions. The second part, on the higher religions, was by the respected scholar J. Aston Carpenter, James Martineau's successor as principal of Manchester College, which had lately been transplanted from London to Oxford. Carpenter's entry was essentially an essay in comparative religion, as we would understand it, an interest his teacher at Martineau could never comprehend. And all this feeds into a newly fraternal and hospitable relationship, with notable exceptions, among denominations and into the ecumenical movement, which is a striking characteristic of organized religion today. Prophetically, the early 90s saw a series of ecumenical conferences held at Grindelwald in Switzerland, the brainchild of Henry Lunn, a Methodist minister whose hoped-for missionary career had been diverted by ill health. I'm sure that the participants benefited greatly, but the long-range result was Lunn's founding of a famous English travel agency. But what are those believers left behind by this new religious liberalism? New sects had been founded from the 1840s. The Plymouth Brethren in that decade, the Salvation Army shortly after, Jehovah's Witnesses and other similar groups in the 20th century. It is significant that the terms fundamentalism or literalism are locutions with origins in the 1920s. Today, the traditional embodiments of Protestantism on both sides of the Atlantic are shrinking in numbers and influence in a more and more secularist world. The dissenters in England have grown more marginal, as have mainstream Protestant churches in this country. The Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church are more and more preoccupied by internal disciplinary problems. For Anglicans, how to accommodate women, or more recently gays, in the higher ranks of their ministry, and how to maintain the worldwide Anglican communion in the face of rebellion of conservative elements in England and America, and the fraternal relations these elements have established or threatened to establish with the more biblically centered African churches. Roman Catholics have had to cope not only with the disciplinary challenges that have recently arisen within the priesthood, and indeed with questions about the very definition of priesthood, but with reorienting a universal church from an increasingly secular Europe and a Latin American church responsive to new, often Pentecostal sects, to the comparative security of Christian Asia and Africa. Now, I do not think the churches are going to disappear from England, though their ranks may well thin out and the congregations continue to shrink. There will always be worshipers motivated by genuine belief, the quest for familiarity, by fear or suffering or altruism, by family traditions, baptisms, weddings, funerals, and family loyalty, or by what I like to think of as civic religion, not just the observance of grand state or municipal occasions, but of a sense that church provides a cement to a community or the nation to bind them together. But this inwardness, both individual and institutional, may suggest that Francis Bacon, while undoubtedly a prophet of modern science, may also recover a role rejected for him in the 18th and 19th centuries as a prophet of religion, which in the 20th century and after has been more and more obedient to internal mandates and far less connected to the continuing challenges posed in our time by science. Thank you. I have a perhaps convenient problem with my hearing. Therefore, I'm going to ask that you direct your questions to a surrogate who will pass them on to me. And I hope nothing is lost in the transition.
And I think Sandra has volunteered to help you as well.
I'll be the surrogate.
So, okay.
Thank you.
So, and I'll keep an eye out for hands. So, questions? Yes.
I have a rather complex and broad question. so I hope I can articulate it in a concise way. First of all, would it be helpful to look at congregations in this time, in your long 18th century, or not congregations, but a population that's practicing either dissenters or Anglicans, as a kind of bell curve, where the outliers would be, for instance, those who are truly devout and regular practicers, and those who don't really pay much attention. And then in the center, you have those who are regular churchgoers and occasional practicers, and then those who, regular churchgoers and kind of regular practicers of the faith, and then occasional churchgoers who show up every so often. If that's a helpful way of thinking of that population, does that change over your long 18th century? And is there a difference in the way that bell curve would be shaped amongst dissenters and Anglicans?
I think I got that.
Okay.
When I got my first trial hearing aids, the doctor said, I had complained to the doctor that my wife and daughters kept saying that I wasn't hearing them. And he said, well, this will help a lot with your students. And I said, I'm not having any trouble with my students. And he said, well, it's because you're proceeding from a common ground. And the hearing tests consist of nonsense syllables. And I said, what are you saying about my wife and daughter? But I think it was because I saw exactly where you were coming from, that I actually heard you. I hope accurately. Now, as I said early on in the talk, congregational records don't give us a lot on this. And finding the documents that do tell us about that, diaries or letters, they exist, but finding them in a lifetime is not easy. So there is a lot of chance to this. But what I do think, and what I was trying to argue here, is that for all the persistence of loyalty and deep concern, deep religious feelings, there is a shift within, to say the French historians talk about a longue durée. Over the long period, there are waves within the long wave. And that's what I was trying to argue here, but it is awfully hard to demonstrate in the detail one would like to mount to be totally convincing. So, is that a help?
Yes, very helpful, thank you.
Other questions?
I have a question about the role of political economy. You mentioned Hartley, and is Hartley a connection? You mentioned his influence on Bentham and the utilitarians. Is Hartley a connection with the evolution of political economy, and what is the role of political economy in Unitarian thinking in the 19th century?
Well, I think it's enormously important. Hartley did not, so far as I know, personally know the utilitarians, but they much admired what he did. Not the second volume, which couldn't have concerned them less, but the mechanisms, the psychological mechanisms, the first volume. And that feeds, it seems to me, very naturally into political economy. If one looks at Olivy's Growth of Philosophic Radicalism, Hartley plays a very important role in that. He's been probably the most important source of awareness of Hartley's importance until relatively recently. Bentham didn't at all approve of the religious speculations that flowed from all of this. But the mechanisms, psychological mechanisms, seem to make very good sense. And behind the popularization of political economy in the early 19th century lay this view that people could learn these things, that the reactions could be built in and triggered, and people would behave rationally and sensibly, as you know, not really true. But at any rate, that was the theory.
Yes.
Wallace Notstein long ago said that if you look at the major donors, givers in a parish, you will find them on the way to being Puritans, and later on the way to being dissenters, and he made a relation which is not necessarily a class one, but a relationship between donations to the established church that they belong to, and a kind of questioning of its doctrines, of its teachings, or of the minister, or whatever. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's terribly important. The role of donors and major donors is really, really big, no matter what the congregation one is looking at. In the church, because of the parish system, someone who founds a parish, builds the church, counted for a lot. And there is one village, I don't remember its name, in Cambridgeshire or Suffolk, which has two equally ground churches side by side, built by sisters who couldn't stand each other. But among the Unitarians, one instance that I know is in a manufacturing town north of Manchester called Todmorden. And that was a company town, and the church was established by the family, as happened in a lot of places. And then ultimately the time came where the family got tired of all this. They didn't want to have to put up with the administrative business, with checking all the accounts. Well, they often had the accounts checked by clerks in their factories, but having to do all that scut work was too much. So they went to the congregation and they said, look, we want to turn the whole management of things over to you. Well, this produced varying degrees of panic, because at least in a couple of cases I knew about, it meant learning from scratch how to run the parish. And to see that documented in the minutes is really very exciting. They had to learn bookkeeping, they had to learn what the minister was paid, they had to learn what annuities meant. All of that they could just before have blithely referred to the family. There's another town north of Manchester which has two very grand churches, one Unitarian, one Congregationalist, across the street from each other. And they were built by rival industrialists who were nevertheless very good friends. And so there was this kind of friendly competition as to whose final tower was going to be finished first. But these endowments are enormously important. Now, I've seen in the argument made, heard it made by ministers, that an endowment is a death knell to a congregation, because it removes any feeling that the members have that they have to buckle down and support the congregation in its mission. let's just refer it to the Fieldings or whoever. But it is, that kind of support is enormously important. And it conferred, of course, great power on the donor. Maybe even if he wasn't a donor, just by virtue of it being so damn rich, and devoted to the parish or the chapel, he carried an excessive amount of weight.
Any other questions?
In this period, say from 1680 to 1880, is anti-Trinitarianism always an argument about the status of Jesus, or are there other considerations that might enter in?
Well, now, at this point, I will turn to a family member to have a complete translation.
Is, in this long 18th century, is anti-Trinitarianism only to do with the figure of Jesus, or were there other considerations?
To me, Jim, you can speak to this more authoritatively than I, the great gap in Trinitarian theory is the Holy Ghost. He is invoked every Sunday in the creeds, and he's never heard from him again after that, except occasionally as the bearer of divine will. It is really about the relationship of the first two persons of the Trinity. And of course, is a debate that goes back to the beginning of Christianity, almost the beginning, and the very complex role of the Council of Nicaea and subsequent councils in formulating the creeds. I don't pretend to understand the battles that went on about all of this in the early church. But by the 18th century, it does become a question increasingly of the humanity of Jesus. When I said that there was a transition through so-called Arianism in the early 18th century, that doctrine had been formulated in 1706 by a very important minister in the Church of England, the parish of St. James Piccadilly, and he cataloged all the references in the Bible to the Trinity and tried to analyze what the balance was in those references between Jesus as divine and Jesus as human. And because there was a certain, in a common sense age, there was a certain difficulty in explaining how three persons could be one. One Unitarian minister in the early 19th century, the Martineau family congregation, liked to take 3 water glasses and put them down and count them and say, now, I ask you, how can these 3 be one? I suppose, come to think of it, if you smash them up and put them into a pile, they'd be one. But it was that kind of often very literal questioning, which was natural to a common sense age like that, in which the theological subtleties that serious treatises on the Trinity don't really take account of. But by the 19th century, the humanist theology was winning out over the divine, and Jesus as a great and good man whom one could admire deeply and who served as an example as well as a teacher, was overwhelmingly the thing that stimulated people to go to Unitarianism. They felt they'd lost a lot, at least some of them. There were serious efforts on the part of Unitarians to set up something that would bring in the latitudinarians from the Church of England. But they kept encountering people who missed the liturgy, which I fully understand. That really very powerful effect of the language that Cranmer had provided. And so there's a book on the writing of dissenting liturgies and a catalog of Unitarian liturgies, which are innumerable, and I must say, compared to the original English version, terribly boring. They tried. The same was true of their hymnals. People want the familiar, and they miss it when they don't have it. There were some good Unitarian hymns written, but getting them adopted was another matter.
I think we should